Hello everyone, today we talk about France and England after the Hundred Years' War. So just, a broader introduction to what was essentially the process of France's territorial recomposition and the Wars of the Roses in England. And naturally these were direct consequences of the outcome of the Hundred Years' War. And let's see how the two countries managed the situation. So in order to reorganize the kingdom, Charles VII of France had first of all to get past, or at least destroy, basically an obstacle. That is the presence of those great feudal principalities that had prevented the unitary management of the kingdom, and especially in the latter phase of the Hundred Years' War had been particularly dangerous in the sense, first of all, Burgundy, right, the Dutch of Burgundy, also the Dutch of Bretagne that was playing another card, but still, and also others that had yet to be essentially at least brought again under the crown control. And the ends of the war had surely brought France to reinforce also its military apparatus and its central control, and essentially that kind of still highly nobiliar character that the state, the crown had given to the state was being formed. So with an imposing military force, but not only, because certain prerogatives naturally were not to be erased from the traditional, from local customs, from the ways that the crown could claim some rights over such fiefs. And so these two important entities, Burgundy and Bretagne, were dealt with in the following way. After Charles VII followed his son, Louis XI, was very different from his father, given that he managed to that he knew how to manage energically and shrewdly French affairs. At the beginning of his reign, the great nobility, understanding too well the king's project, had founded, in order to resist him, the so-called League of Common Good, Commonweal. And this was done naturally through private means, in a way that were appealing to the autonomistic tradition of the fiefs. And Louis responded by negotiating, and through such process, he knew how essentially to empty of content the opponent's union. Right. First of all, he absorbed with a series of agreements the possessions of the House of Anjou between 1475 and 1480. So this important central kind of northern power was also bordering with Bretagne, by the way, and controlling the Loire, important castles, important strongholds. Then he essentially managed to get rid of the Burgundian problem by international cooperation with the Roman Germanic Emperor and the Swiss, right? That in 1477 managed to crush the Burgundian duchy that had the Burgundian state at that point, that starting from the Duchy of Burgundy, as you know, had consolidated its control on these wide areas between France and the Empire, encompassing also the lowlands, the important Flemish urban centers, and thus becoming a state within the state, or across the state, given that in fact was across France and Germany in a way, and that had gained such consistency, in fact, during the moment of greatest weakness of the French crown during the Hundred Years' War. And the Swiss were emerging. We will talk soon about Burgundy and the Swiss properly, but Swiss had been emerging as the confederacy since the 14th century, with broader ambitions, also expansionistic ones, against Savoy, against even against Milan, and it had been threatened fundamentally by Burgundian expansion, and managed to crush, right, win a series of striking victories. The Burgundian army that at that point seemed as the most advanced in Europe, together with the Venetian conduct, and that instead crumbled in all these battles that we still have to study. In part, we made multiple videos on the Burgundian army at this point, explaining a bit how it's important to observe how the military system worked independently also on the outcome in a way, right? Because there were other factors that were in the way, and that were not necessarily due to the quality of the system in itself, but rather with, in part, the Swiss advancements in tactics that surely were something really exceptional in the future, as you know, at that point. But that also can be, attributed to faults of command and simply certain contingental situations that may have gone things in fact go differently. Never underestimate it. There's no such thing like a military system that always prevails just because of the sake of it. There's an absolute super. It doesn't mean anything, right? It's always about it's always about chance in different proportions. And still, the Swiss scored this astonishing amount of victories, and France was if you want, the main beneficiary of this from one side, right, in absolute terms, given that he basically incorporated all back the Duchy of Burgundy that was, and also the surrounding Central European areas, whereas as you know, the Flanders would go. The Netherlands would go to the Habsburgs through the matrimonial tie with Charles the Bold's daughter, and in fact Maximilian, and that's another story. But it's connected, of course, to the thing, and this triggered important international dynamics as well. But the Duchy of Burgundy, from within France, it was properly a French fief, was essentially a Capetian possession, as we have explained multiple times when we talk about the Capetians, the Valois Angoulême, the Valois Burgundy in this case also. We're not really talking about other families. They were the same Capetians, right? Just different branches that taken the name after that. And that, as we've seen, the Burgundians hadn't had basically any scruple to go against the main Valois line, against the crown itself, to pursue their objectives. They let fundamentally the English in, and they were about to wipe out jointly French crown, but things went differently, and the Duchy of Burgundy was very advanced by medieval standard. It had all a tradition of autonomy from one side, but also in terms of external relations, but also of internal centralization. And it was extremely rich, by the way, productive. Think about all the wine, at some point in the 13th century it was said the Burgundians didn't even work the land except for the vineyards, because that they could buy anything else just through selling wine. And here, naturally, the thing is hyperbolic, but it still gives you an idea of the enormous, also the land mass. It's not huge, but the Duchy of Burgundy itself, but also the other dependencies, of course, were big. Also in the northeast of France, in Artois, in other areas, the French kept expanding this point, so they reinforced dramatically, especially their eastern frontier, and France basically has just that one, because in the south with Spain, yes, it would be reopened in a way soon, but for the rest, it's England had been kept at bay. And the only great independent duchy in France at this point was the one of Brittany, of Bretagne. Because you see, in the south of France, basically everything had been wiped out in terms of autonomistic tendencies since the 13th century. There was at least no main lordship, right, a fief that could oppose anything. Bretagne had been historically always out of the games, right? They had always remained peripheral, autonomous, As you know, they have maintained their customs. Their language was essentially Celtic in nature. So the matter was settled in 1491 through the marriage of the new king Charles VIII, 1483 and 1498, and the Duchess Anne of Bretagne. That also, however, maintained some kind of autonomy, because really they could, even if this was a inheritance deal through the dynastic ties and succession, etc., still Brittany maintained for some time its own consistent autonomy, even within the French kingdom. So in a way we could say that modern France had thus been born, right, in the modern boundaries in terms of its political, territorial, statal unity, right? That's what the foundations had been laid, and this had made of France the most powerful country in Europe, and it would remain essentially so, unitary throughout the centuries. So the ecclesiastical matters had been also, because in domestic policy was particularly important, also institutionally speaking. The matter of the Gallican Church fundamentally had brought to the regulation by the so-called pragmatic sanction of Bourges of 1438. This essentially laid the basis for a properly Gallican Church that would be respecting the spiritual authority of the Pope, but controlled by the king only, controlled by the king under the political point of view, right? So you understand these machinations were happening way before the end of the 100 Years' War, but they were properly a French tradition. The French Church had always been somewhat autonomous from the one of Rome, and at the rise of the French power, the political control of the crown had increased on the ecclesiastical affairs, right? And France remained, at that point things were starting to go a bit more national in interest, but essentially, France would remain faithful to Catholicism. So, but it's just the power of the country that would bring to some attritions, also in war, even with the papacy at some point in the 16th century, but not because of essentially of religious causes in this regard. It was just a tendency from the side of the king to have such high political prestige. This was a tradition, as we know, was reinforced dramatically under the kingdom of Louis IX, the saint that was absolutely respectful towards the papacy, but would still not tolerate interference in the management of the French Church. The Caesar-papistic ideology had been brought to the extreme consequences by Philip IV. So it was kind of one of those characters that a restored French state would essentially reinforce further. From a juridical point of view, the French sovereign governed, supported by the Parlement, while a series of ordinances established between 1446 and 1454 granted a rationalization in a statal sense of the old feudal prerogatives, feudal and community prerogatives, and from the fiscal point of view, the country was divided in four great generalities, right? And the tax outputs allowed, among other things, the maintenance of a permanent army, which the vicissitudes of the 100 Years' War had brought, to emerge automatically, let's say, by already the mid 14th century. Basically, how this was born is that the French king wouldn't disband the troops that were in service during the season for winter, and so that was the beginning of a continuity, properly in the presence of permanent forces, not much of in an organic sense. But you see, medieval kings had always had some kind of permanent troops, if anything, their retinues and the garrisons and so on. But at this point, it was properly the nucleus of what we can call an army. that was naturally integrated with all the various levy systems. The ordonnance was the thing. It had been also in Burgundy the case, and the objective was always to, of course, to have this, always kind of semi-professional core of troops eventually to be integrated by the ones that would be necessary in time of war, right? But for that matter, maintaining otherwise a deterrent capacity over the country. Then there were the general estates that essentially represented, as you know, the clergy, the nobility, and the so-called third state, so the bourgeoisie. Fundamentally, the peasants had been wiped out in terms of political representation since the time of the Jacquerie. Cities instead had risen importantly in power, and they had fundamentally joined the nobility in the repression of the countryside. But at this point, also cities become the hub of international trade. Properly, they towards the modern age, they become ever more detached from their hinterland, right, with the relation with the countryside, because peasants had lost properly any autonomy, any kind of leverage, power, political affairs, and greater dynamics were fundamentally making at that point the subservience of the countryside was given for granted. So it would keep working without further instances, claims, etc. But the general estates, as you know, in France were not called frequently, right? And so actually the stabilization of the crown brought to, in fact, their call to be ever less often. But France was developing all a juridical culture that fundamentally agreed on the necessity of having a king, a strong monarchy fundamentally to maintain control of this enormous land, and that was still very diverse in its own nature, right? As we have explained also at the time, the heart of the French power was the north. There were other lands that were traditionally very, different, properly, even in language and culture and so on. So it was seen as, still in some countries today, that are either very large or they have kind of a centrifugal pressure. They of course, there is a lack in kind of representation, even democratic elements, because if you want to keep the thing all together and remain powerful, you have to sacrifice that in a sense. Not that it is something terrible. Let's say there was a general consensus in France for this thing to happen, very differently from England in general, that had at that point already been marked from a couple of centuries to the limitations of the crown by the parliament. But as we will see now, especially after the Wars of the Roses, something in mechanism would change even in there. For this reason, the king was cited ever more frequently by the Grand Royal Council. So it's kind of, can't say private system, but say something that was much more monarchic oriented and controlled than the parliament that would be called just in moments of difficulty, particular difficulty. It was mostly for levying the money for the army, right? The Grand Council was operative since 1497. So there was also a path aimed at the bureaucratization of the kingdom that France had, if you want, not interrupted, but the 100 Years' War had disrupted largely the possibility of carrying out a unitary, comprehensive improvement of reforms, etc. Certain areas of the country had probably been cut out from monarchic power, from monarchic rule for a long time. Think about the devastations. I mean, the collapse of that big system that by the early 14th century the French had already established was beginning to crack also because of the great expansion of previous centuries, and now the crisis that was striking. Europe at that point. So in a way, the 100 Years' War did pass also through the weakness of this great giant who was collapsing in many historical instances. It's not much an external pressure that makes the thing fall. It's just the pressure is a consequence of the internal collapse, right? Because the enemies see the weakness and they want to exploit. So the English had operated in that regard, and also quite effectively. We can't speak properly of a centralization in a modern sense, because France still maintained a kind of feudal outlook, right? The nobility was very important still, and this was reflected also in the French army that factually was very good at essentially two things: heavy cavalry and artillery, right? The French at this point developed, also by imitation with Burgundians, or at least those had begun before, to produce an important artillery park, differently from other countries that, I don't know, could be more advanced in artillery technology, but not having the means to field such enormous parks. In fact, that would be even during Charles VIII invasion of Italy later on. But we can't speak of a concentration, if any, or a centralization in terms of course, the creation of a state that was based on such local representation, but also on the deterrence represented by the crown and its possessions, and increasing the cooptation of the middle classes, right? This was evident before. We were saying how important the cities were, for example, in even competing among each other, gaining favor. France had many important ones, also important coastal centers that kind of raced against one another to provide the best services to the king for getting privileges in exchange and so on. This was naturally a move to centralize, right? To subtract power to the high nobility that sometimes had literally states within states. Think about the Bourbon, even during the Italian wars, that they were literally another state within France doing something else, right? At a point that the King of France confiscated their lands, and so they also passed to the Spanish and so on. That there is that kind of trouble, right? That France will never fundamentally see, the end of until Louis XIV. Think, about the Fronde, etc. The French nobility always maintained that kind of upper hand. In the army, they wouldn't allow to develop essentially a French native infantry, right? We made a video about this in the French army of the Italian French infantry of the Italian wars. So we've seen how fundamentally the French kept using Swiss mercenaries because they didn't want to have a class of thousands of men. At that point was the standard for infantry, right? From, in fact, the same Swiss reforms, the pike squares of thousands of men that could be distributed in France to become kind of a dangerous subversive force of military expert that would claim more rights, prerogatives, and so on. The French, telling the truth, would try that at some point. Especially the same crown was more interested in it than the nobility. But again, the nobility prevented that, and probably the reason why the French lost the Italian wars is owed in great part to this missed opportunity, because France at that point, if they had unlocked their the enlisting of infantry of French, and enlarged their infantry capacity, would have had the strongest infantry in Europe. That there is no doubt about that, and it wouldn't happen. In any case, properly in the bureaucracy, the middle classes were co-opted by the king, that in this sense controlled certain, say, mechanisms, infrastructures, administration that the nobility didn't quite do, because they were not at the level of the crown. So that's where the king could do this. And so there is and again, this was a 14th century trend already. That's so the growth of the so-called noblesse de robe, so functionaries, jurists, etc., next to the old noblesse de paix that was instead feudal in nature. So, so it was a nobility of office, of robe, properly, of cloth, rather, and a nobility of blood, a nobility of sword. It was the traditional nobility. So, in England, things were naturally different, as a different country, and especially now a different, let's say, a country that had lost the war, and also the opportunity of exploiting the same French power with their own favor. France kept interfering in English affairs, and the let's say the latter phase of the Hundred Years' War had much discredited the Lancastrian monarchy. This was determined also by the personal conditions of Henry VI, that had essentially become king in minority and was not quite of a capable ruler. Right, he came to age in 1442, but he was weak and probably psychologically unstable. So his wife Margaret of Anjou had thus tried to maintain power, allying not just with the House of Lancaster but also the one of Beaufort, and thus bringing to the triggering the reaction. Well, another great prince, Richard, Duke of York, who had ended up to even discussing the Lancastrian right to the throne. So these were technically all descendants of the old Plantagenet line, right? Even in here, they, like in France, they took the name from the various fiefs that they basically had. So these reasons and others triggered the long period. Let's say there were different wars, but we call it the War of Wars. In fact, it's better of the roses, the two roses, taking the name from the houses of Lancaster and of York, that had as heraldic symbol respectively a red and a white rose. After Richard's death, his son managed to defeat the Lancastrians and to take the crown with the name of Edward IV. We made videos about the Battle of Tewkesbury, Battle of Barnet, etc. So you can go check that. We will expand on all the battles of the Wars of the Roses. This was Edward IV, 1461-1483. And so the English crisis was naturally exploited from the continent, because in the meanwhile there was still the opposition between Louis XI and Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who were respectively supporting the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. In fact, the prevalence of the Yorks had been brought in these two aforementioned battles because of Charles the Bold's support, even this military one. After Edward had been exiled, he went to Burgundy, and then he landed again in England with also some Burgundian forces. And anyhow, after the establishment of Yorkist power, at a point, Richard III of York, brother of Edward, 1483-1485, rose to the throne. However, Richard's crimes had brought already to the alienation of great part of the English ruling class, and also tired of 30 years of war at this point, the English sought a sovereign that could bring an end to these contrasts. So they found him in Henry of the House of Tudor, that was of Lancastrian descent, and had married, however, a York. And strong of the French support, Henry Tudor, in fact, defeated Richard, who fell on the battlefield of Bosworth in August of 1485, and thus Henry could rise to the throne with the name of Henry VII, 1485, 1509, and as King of England, starting that process of, I mean, in insight, ex post, we can spot the process, say, of modernization and centralization that would bring to the, Tudor, we can call it even absolutism in a sense, in the 16th century. And just like Louis XI in France, Henry VII realized that if the crown wished to be strong, he had to eliminate the feudal resistance, right? And in this, he was facilitated by the fact that the Wars of the Roses had fundamentally decimated the English nobility. The Wars of the Roses, we made videos about them explaining essentially what they were in nature, mostly from a military point of view, but this reflected the political one. Essentially, England was not particularly disrupted by these clashes. It was mostly a problem of political stability rather than anything, because these were old noblemen that essentially wanted to kill each other for dynastic reasons. So if they took each other out, literally from a biological point of view, they could inherit this or that power, right? Secure their own. Of course, there were troubles, there were rebellions. There were certain areas the Scots were still interfering somewhat in the north, in the border, but there weren't massive disruptions, right? None of what France had suffered during the 100 Years' War, right? But still, it was a moment of indefinite because it was still, at the end of the day, the nobility managing the situation quite privately. So the country altogether didn't want these noblemen just to spend their time killing each other. They wanted to govern the kingdom with some continuity. And consider that this had happened also largely because the English nobility was habituated during the 100 Years' War, essentially, of going out there in France and profiting from it. And aside from their old ties, in a sense, to the country, the nobility had anglicized by that point, let's say, but there were many more chances for enrichment, right? Much greater ambitions to be, pursued and so on. In England, the place was too narrow for all of them, so they started taking each other out in that way. So at the end of the war, the House of the Lords had been decimated fundamentally. So the Tudor were favored by the situation. Henry VII governed with the help of two councils, essentially the Privy Council and the Star Chamber, the task of which was essentially to provide the throne with the juridical and administrative support aimed at reducing to the minimum, let's say, the powers of the feudal class. And this was obtained in two ways: augmenting the alliances that were directly subjected to the crown. So, as you understand, that had happened already because of that concentration of the same Tudor were biological representative of that, being essentially both Lancastrian and Yorkist in blood, and so having these different prerogatives that were reflected in inheritance and so on. But also, they kept confiscating, as you know. It was kind of the mean, in a way. In these modern states states that were being born as modern, right? There was not much an anxiety for centralizing in a direct sense. They were always trying mostly to strip somebody else of something, still maintaining the system somewhat private, even from the royal dynasty point of view. Think even about the Anglican reform, and what the Tudor did all along was just basically confiscating goods, in that case of the church, in our way. But the ones who found themselves at the point there was nothing much more that could be confiscated, the Stuarts were the ones who started making something more, really centralistic, and they triggered, the English Civil War in the process. But it was a long journey, because you don't pass literally from a medieval kingdom to a modern state overnight, right? So the Tudor surely set this trend, but it was also still the beginning. The other way was also, and this is really important, encouraging trade, manufactures, the development of a gentry, right? So essentially a petty nobility of bourgeois origin that provided the king with the administrative and juridical cadres necessary to a centralizing government. So as you see, this is a common feature that, as we have seen also in France, was taking place. And in France, it was relatively easier to do that. If anything, because there were more resources, it was a more diverse country, was simply richer and larger, and you could really find some mechanism in that sense. England, in the moment it lost virtually almost all of its French possessions, it had remained cut out of Europe, quite literally meant, meaning that also much of what concerned even the military development, the material, the techniques, the skills, they had to import armor from Italy, from Germany. They had to import horses, artillery from Flanders. There was all a, England by itself now, it was starting to gradually lag behind, right? The English army also remained quite conservative in nature. As you know, the Wars of the Roses were mostly fought still on foot by men-at-arms. With longbows, right, in a typical English fashion. By up to the mid 16th century, that still could work fundamentally, but with the gradual, it's not much even a tactical problem in itself. It's simply the consequence of the pike and shot development by the development of other states in the continent, the Empire, France, etc. That would make the English army at that point, requiring a more centralized system to be competitive in the first place, right? But the navy, right, the maritime expansion, this was really important, and also the creation of a national mythology. Even in there, the gentry. Think about even the longbow that we just mentioned. It became gradually ever less important, but still it was kind of a symbol of the English gentry. In a way, right? And so there was some idea now that, of course, because the English, they never gave up the claims on the French throne, but they realized that they had to restart now from merely English basis. Henry VII, still in the frame of a development of bourgeoisie that could be alternative to the power of the old nobility, promoted also the shipbuilding and the maritime activities. So launch in England, if you want, that up to that point was essentially had been a agricultural and pastoral country, to a real renewal that would have built in the following centuries its own imperial fortune eventually. Even here, just very much on, it's a long shot by the time, but it began at that point. After all, again, this was a consequence of the end of the 100 Years' War. Not much of a continental interest, so, what about the sea? And so that began, because up to that point, England, like most feudal monarchies in Europe, had never really had a real, maritime interest that would go aside from some limited activities and so on. And this naturally went in parallel with broader developments that were occurring at the time in European culture, navigation, technology, and so on. But still, taking some time, and especially needing some assets and investments for taking off, right? So that maritime interest, that kind of entrepreneurial, autonomous activity, etc., was also the basis of a new way of thinking that was essentially projected the creation of a class of sailors, of entrepreneurs, of people that were of businessmen, if you want, that would also eventually give that unprejudiced touch, right? Also scientifically oriented to the Protestant instances and the needs essentially for some larger freedoms that also were the monarchy later on would try to restrict, is to ask to demand for money on taxes for and so all with some technical skills and studies and a scientific bias that eventually with the reform would be, and the Counter-Reformation would be reduced in the Catholic countries that to that point had been on the fore basically on any scientific every scientific level, then to gradually be reduced and to instead make in part the Protestants. It's not just about Protestantism, right? Scotland and Hungary, I don't know, were Protestant in the middle in the the modern age, but surely they weren't a particularly successful country from an economical point of view. But the in part this held properly as a mentality, and at that point also as a properly English mentality in a truly unitary sense, because as you understand, after the end of the 100 Years' War, the same monarchy anglicized further. We have seen this had already happened after Bouvines and the Magna Carta. Well, after the 100 Years' War, the anglicization of the kingdom was in the ruling classes of the monarchy was consolidated, was properly established, right, for good. In any case, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.